I'm Jane Alexander, Nantucket Book Festival alumna, welcoming you to At Home with Authors.
William Cohan, thank you so much for joining us on At Home with Authors.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Preparing to speak with you was an amazing, amazing experience because at first, given what was going on, I thought, well, I'm not sure William Cohan's work is going to be relevant. And as I started to read, I got obsessed with the whole body of your work. And I realized that it is as relevant or more relevant than at any time I think we've ever experienced. You're going to tell me if I'm right, but
well, it's certainly nice of you to say.
Well, I think so. Look, maybe I'll help you discover something that you didn't even realize. So I'd love to start just with some synergy between you and another of our authors who we recently posted just a few days ago, Mitchell Jackson. And have you had a chance to listen to that?
Yes, of course.
So first, we're going to play this clip from Mitchell Jackson on reimagining the pie.
People have things, people don't have things. The way in which people have or don't have things is connected to race and class, and we got to figure out how to reimagine that. Who is going to be the one that says, I'm going to give up some of this, I'm going to cut this pie up? And it's going to mean a lot less for the people who got pie. Because no one riots when they got pie, right? Like, who would be out there in the streets? Who would be getting murdered if they had pie? So I don't know how we divide up the pie more evenly, but I do know that to me this is is race, but the race is you cannot disconnect it from class, and the class is built into all of these issues.
What did you think about when you heard Mitchell Jackson's riff on reimagining the pie?
I mean, I spent 17 years on Wall Street trying to help people get bigger pieces of the pie, and not just rich white people, but all people who were sort of trying to get more of the pie. And now I've almost spent another 17 years writing about that, but not only, of course, about Wall Street, but predominantly about Wall Street. I mean, I guess my thought is that, on the one hand, it's he's absolutely right that, the people with pie are not out there in the streets protesting. They might be sympathetic and wanting to make changes without actually physically protesting. So there are certainly plenty of people I know who feel that way. But this has been a long-standing problem. I mean, I feel like, not to be too cynical about it, but, we've been talking about things like redistributing the wealth. We've been talking about things like gun control. We've been talking about police brutality. We've been talking about racial inequality, for generations. And while it seems acute at the moment, I unfortunately despair a little bit about our society's ability to change itself and to change its behavior, especially without, substantive leadership at the top, sort of pushing for the change.
I was actually struck by the subtitle of your latest book. It's Four Friends, Promising Lives Cut Short. And just for people who haven't read it yet, the setting of that book begins in Phillips Academy, where you went to school, which, I mean, you talk about sort of a privileged education. That is about as privileged as it gets. And yet, Four Lives Cut Short, which almost feels to me like it could be the subtitle, Promising Lives Cut Short, the subtitle of Black in America in many ways, right? And
absolutely,
I'd love you to be able to tell our audience a little bit about these lives cut short, and maybe how when we see it through that perspective, maybe we can understand a little more about this broader societal issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think for better or for worse, at that time, which, when I went to Andover, it was in the early 70s. Obviously, I think it's fair to say that there had been some progress made as a result of the civil rights movement in trying to rectify past sins in our society. And going to Andover at that time, I mean, I knew it was a privileged environment, but it's not like, the whole sort of wave of billionaire finance guys and hedge fund guys and private equity guys, that was all in the future, and the children of all those people were all in the future. So, I mean, it seemed incredibly ecumenical to me, and like the most ecumenical place I've ever been. College seemed much more socially and economically stratified. But Andover did not. One of the themes of Andover, one of the mottos of Andover, was sort of youth from every quarter. And I think, especially at that time, Ted Sizer, who had just come from being the dean of the Harvard School of Education, and had just overseen the merger between Andover and Abbott to create a co-ed school. I just thought that this was an incredibly sort of enlightened and ecumenical place. And I did not feel like I was in the midst of privilege, except for when I would see, obviously when John F. Kennedy Jr. is there, son of a president, or Will Daniel, a grandson of a president, is there, and they're my friends. I know this is not Worcester, Massachusetts, but I also felt that I was surrounded by all sorts of people from all different walks of life who were just there to learn and to be intellectually curious and to try to get a very good education and then sort of go out into the world and make a difference. So that's what was sort of inculcated into me and others during that time. Now you hear Andover as sort of the most, privileged elite prep school, and it sort of immediately rings all sorts of bells about, children of billionaires and hedge fund managers and white privilege and all of that. It just wasn't like that at that time. And so, what prompted me to write the book, there were a couple of things. One is that I, like my other books, wanted a serious reporting challenge, and to write the stories of four of my friends who were not around anymore to tell me those stories was incredibly challenging reportorially. I mean, it ranged. Obviously, writing about JFK Jr. was a lot easier than writing about Jack Berman or Harry Bull or Will Daniel. But as sort of the years went on, and this was a time as well, you have to remember, before social media. I know that's impossible to remember now. Before social media, before cell phones, before it was easy to keep in touch with people after you no longer were in their immediate presence. I had, of course, been friendly with these people, but had lost touch with them because we all went our separate ways, and that's just the way it was. And so, over the years, as we got into our 30s, I realized, I had lost touch with them, which is fine, and that's just what happens in life. And B, I, noticed that a few of them had started, a disproportionate number had died in tragic ways. And I sort of collected those facts in my mind and decided, after having written the Duke Lacrosse case, after writing the book Why Wall Street Matters and the other 3 books about Wall Street, that I needed to explore a different vein. I needed to think about how I was going to remember my friends and also explore the fragility of life. Because one thing, that we were taught in Andover, and I was sort of forced to study, was the French existentialists, philosophers, and I was sort of forced to study them in the original French, which is brutal. I mean, it's brutal in English, until they started writing more plays and becoming more journalistic in their writing. And so, I was absorbing about, a small percentage of what I was actually reading in the actual French. But what I was absorbing enough to know that their whole philosophy was about the fragility of life and, living life to its fullest, because you never know when it's going to end, and we're only here for a short amount of time. And so that was sort of an idea I'd kept with me for a very long time.
You mentioned the French existentialists. Just the other day, I was searching, you might know the quote in French, Sartre said. This is the first time I've said Sartre said in a conversation I've had with anybody in ages. But Sartre talked about how the most fulfilling time in his life, when he had the least existential anxiety about choices, was when he was in the French resistance. He knew that's what he had to be doing at that moment. I almost feel like this moment is that time for a lot of people.
Well, it is. And I was just having a conversation with my older son, who just graduated from Columbia Law School. And, in an age of COVID, which is obviously still ongoing, how do you express your desire to participate in this historical moment? It's one thing if you're in your 20s and you want to protest where everybody's, back close together again, whether they're wearing masks or not. And then you're going to return to be with your family, right? To be with your parents who are our age, who are, on the edge of being the most vulnerable. It's a big question for them to answer. And we were just talking about, what's the right thing to do? And, I don't know the answer. I mean, I guess my fallback position is there are other ways to participate in the protest and without actually physically being, on Fifth Avenue protesting.
Based on your active participation in the world of mergers and acquisitions and finance, and again, keeping in mind this idea of the pie, what are we going to do? How are we going to grow the pie? Just a few months ago, we could talk about growing the pie. I guess now it's a question of how do we prevent the pie from shrinking too quickly? Or is there a perspective you bring both from your writing and your experience on Wall Street? How do you assess the current situation now? And most importantly, is there any story from your past, whether it's in your specific books or your specific life experience, that you might call on now and help us assess this situation?
Well, look, this is a very important question that you ask. The whole DNA of our country, that idea that you can come from nothing, if you're fortunate, get access to educational opportunities, but take your street smarts, take your intellectual gifts, take whatever God has given you and make something of it for yourself and your family and your family's generations and the society as a whole. That is sort of like a bedrock principle of American society. And, Wall Street is at the left ventricle of that whole idea. It's the whole reason that it's possible to achieve those things. As I write in Why Wall Street Matters, I mean, if Wall Street had not financed a struggling Steve Jobs in the creation of Apple, then there would be no Apple today. And that same story is repeated over and over and over again across the landscape. Whether you hate Jeff Bezos or love Amazon or hate Amazon and love Jeff Bezos, whatever it is, there would be no Amazon without Wall Street. And so there's this symbiotic relationship that exists between capitalism, and not just American capitalism all over the world. I think we can safely agree at this point that capitalism has triumphed over other isms around the world, even in places, like China, not even, obviously astoundingly in places like China, which has allowed millions of people to get out of poverty. I mean, so it's the ism that is surviving. And until there's a new ism then I don't see, unless we want to, and by the way, unless we want to sort of participate and be more like, Denmark or Sweden or Scandinavia and be sort of more socialist, whereas, we don't reward people for their great innovations as much, but we make sure that everybody has a good life, a good education, free healthcare, free education. Unless we're going to go that route, which doesn't seem like we are, but maybe we are, and maybe we should, then I don't see how we begin to address the problems of extreme wealth inequality. I mean, really, are we going to, my son and I talk about this all the time. Why doesn't Jeff Bezos take 30 billion of his 150 billion? That's just a number. He could take more and it wouldn't affect his life, and distribute, $50,000 in stock to his 600,000 Amazon employees. Wouldn't that send just an amazing signal? Nobody's asking him to do it. Just do it. Send that amazing signal. Let everybody see what you're doing. Lead by example. There's nobody doing that. Jeff Bezos isn't doing that. And maybe 50,000 isn't enough, but it's a way. Maybe he should do 60 billion and give everybody 100,000 of stock and let them participate in this incredible story that is Amazon, whether you like it or not. But you don't see any of these, multi-billionaires who can't possibly spend the money that they have accumulated. And, good for them for doing it, whatever, that's the American way. You don't see them there's no leadership. Where is that kind of leadership? Look, making these anodyne statements on your website.
Let me stop you there, because first of all, that phrase you used, why can't these, innovative, incredible CEOs enable their employees to participate in this story? That's a phrase that I want to keep. So here's my question for you now, digging back into whether it's The Last Tycoons or any of the stories, any of the books that you have written and your own experience on Wall Street, are there any models for the kind of behavior, people who were leaders, they were entrepreneurs, they thrived because of what Wall Street provides, and they brought other people in, a lot of other people to participate in their great stories?
Honestly, Michael, there aren't a lot. There just aren't a lot. Obviously, there have been tycoons who have been extraordinarily generous, whether they did that voluntarily or because to assuage the antitrust police, or to assuage their own guilty conscience, or because they felt it was the right thing. One can't help but admire, what Bill Gates has done, in many respects, by creating the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and what he's devoted himself to doing, and distributing his wealth and getting, so many others to also do that as well. But it's not a but. It's just that, so that helps people who are tremendously less fortunate. But, as Elizabeth Warren said, and I'm no Elizabeth Warren fan, but, when her whole thing about, you didn't build this, we helped make your success possible, and you should keep that in mind. Why are there these huge discrepancies between the wealth of the CEOs and their employees? That's just unconscionable. They could not have achieved the wealth they have achieved without the hard work of their employees. Why not reward them for that?
So take us into the room so you've been in the room where it happens, you've reported on the room where it happens in terms of, the engines for capitalism, the financial engines. Is there something that you've experienced during all those years in those engine rooms that sort of makes it less likely that CEOs in the position to really spread the story, spread the wealth, less likely that they'll do that because of the way things are structured in Wall Street? And is there anything that maybe, if we were to reform things, would serve the purposes of the investment bankers, of the hedge fund managers, of the people who are creating that wealth on that side, serve their interests as well as the interests of the employees who are building this company along with the CEO's vision?
Basically, no. I mean, basically, whether it's quarterly profitability, whether it's research analysts who exist to, make sure that, or to try to make sure that CEOs achieve the profitability that they've promised, so that they can make recommendations to shareholders about what to buy. I mean, the big problem here is this idea of, being a fiduciary responsibility. It sort of makes it so, people can say, well, I don't have a choice. I'm a fiduciary, so therefore I have to maximize, the return for the people I'm a fiduciary for. So that means, CEOs, boards of directors, they're all quote unquote fiduciaries, hedge fund managers, fiduciaries, private equity firms, managers, fiduciaries, asset managers, they all fall under the rubric of being fiduciaries. And so they use that as cover to, frankly, not think about capitalism in a different way. Now, the Business Roundtable in the last few months, when the stock market was hitting its all-time high pre-COVID, started talking about more than just shareholders and getting back to stakeholders. But we're all under the Milton Friedman-esque regime of that companies exist for the benefit of their shareholders, even though there's starting to be lip service about widening out that circle.
So what I just learned from you is, they say some people say history is written by the victors. Our dictionary is created by the victors, because that word fiduciary, you're telling us, that could be defined in a lot of different ways. And it's defined in one way right now that doesn't necessarily serve the interests of our nation.
Right, and there are some who, like Yves Chouinard at Patagonia, for one, has decided that he's going to take a different approach. Now, it's a private company, so he can do what he wants. He doesn't have quote unquote shareholders who public shareholders, and he doesn't have to report quarterly earnings. There are things called these, I guess, B corporations now that are very, very small part of the equation, but exist to allow different ways of organization and different responsibilities, and the notion of fiduciary responsibility isn't quite as large, but there's a huge infrastructure that exists and a wealth creation mechanism that exists and is celebrated in this country by the media, by others, by high society, that exists to support wealth creation among financial types, and I've never been in a room in all those years where I saw somebody say, this isn't what we should be doing. We shouldn't be, doing this merger. Let's not do this merger, because that means it's not the good merger. It's not going to work out. People are going to get hurt. People are going to lose their jobs. Shareholders are going to get hurt, and we won't make a fee. So let's not do it. I've never seen a banker, raise their hand. I mean, if I had said that to Felix Rohatyn, let's not advise RCA on the sale to GE, I mean, my career would be over. If people had said to Mike Milken, we really shouldn't underwrite these bonds of these companies and take the warrants and do all of this, these companies aren't going to make it. We're creating a leveraged disaster. If anybody had said, to AT&T, don't buy Warner Media, Warner Brothers, Warner Communications, Time Warner, and increase your debt load to $180 billion. I mean, you don't get rewarded for things like that. I've been writing about this for so long, I almost don't think about it anymore. For maybe 10 years after the 2008 financial crisis, I would write as often as anybody would let me about how there was a desperate need to change the compensation system on Wall Street. Back when pre-1970, so from like 76 to 1970, like the first 200 years of capitalism, all of the Wall Street investment banks were private partnerships. So all the partners at those firms had their own capital at risk every day. And they only got paid if there was pre-tax income, because then they would distribute the pre-tax income. So that means that whatever it is that they were doing all day, every day, had to be designed to make money and to not just make revenue, but to make profits. So they had to be prudent in their risk-taking. And people hearing this part of our conversation, if there are any, and they who know me will know that this is something that I've just drone on about for a very long time. In fact, I've stopped because it went absolutely nowhere. But at the beginning of 1970, when the investment bank Donaldson, Levkin, Jenrette decided to push to change the New York Stock Exchange rules that prevented New York Stock Exchange firms to go public, and they were successful at doing that. And so in 1970, they went public and forever changed Wall Street. And then in 1971, Merrill Lynch went public, and then one firm after another. In 85, Bear Stearns went public. In 86, Morgan Stanley. In 99, Goldman Sachs. And in 2006, Lazard, where I worked, went public. After 150 years of being a private partnership, changed forever the compensation system on Wall Street. So now bankers and traders get rewarded for generating revenue. That's all they care about. So when your job is to manufacture mortgage-backed securities, that's what you're going to do, regardless of what happens to those mortgage-backed securities when they're sold or what's contained therein. Your whole job, your whole focus in life is to get as big a bonus as you possibly can by manufacturing mortgage-backed securities. That means you package up whatever mortgages you can find. If they became increasingly risky and crappy, you did it anyway because you knew you're going to turn it into a security and sell it off to investors all over the world. And that's how you got your bonus. The only way I would get a bonus, a meaningful bonus, is if I did M&A deals. So, of course, I wasn't rewarded for doing M&A deals. I wasn't rewarded for not doing M&A deals. Maybe the right answer is to not do an M&A deal. Maybe the right answer is to not put together that mortgage-backed security. Maybe the right answer is not to to sell and create all of the risky bonds that were created leading up to February and March of 2020. But nobody gets rewarded for that.
Let me ask you, because we've got 15 more minutes. Can you go a little over?
Sure, do whatever you like.
Great, because I've got all your book titles up here. I've got this big screen. I love this. I just bought the iMac, and it's like, oh my God, I can go to any place. But it's all William Cohan related right now. So you just should know I'm not being ADD distracted. So I see the description. I mean, this is my favorite subtitle. This is why this is the book I want to dig into, and we will get to Four Friends. That's why I want to go a little over. But House of Cards, and the subtitle, A Tale of Hubris and Wretched Excess on Wall Street. That idea of hubris, you probably have a better lens to recognize it, given your reporting, than anyone. Just as you think about hubris today in our society, where is the most dangerous hubris right at this moment? And maybe that we're not recognizing out there.
I think the good news, I think people have recognized it. And, I don't want to get all political here because that tends to offend people, especially people who might be watching this.
Well, you know what? Rather than, let's just take it to your book, House of Cards. Tell me one small tale of hubris from House of Cards. I know the whole thing was about it, but tell me one little anecdote. And then we can all sort of take that behavior in that context, and we can transpose it for ourselves.
Well, look, why did that book is about why Bear Stearns collapsed. And by the time I had gotten done researching and reporting it, what was so obvious to me is again, a question of leadership. Jimmy Kane was a great and charming guy. You understand why he got to the top of Bear Stearns, because he was fun to be with. He liked smoking cigars. He liked playing bridge. He liked, drinking. He told great stories. He was very personable. He was also a good businessman for a time, made a lot of money for the firm trading municipal bonds. And he was a ruthless power player and got to the top of the firm. But, once he got there, he was basically a terrible leader because he took his eye completely off the ball. He had no idea of the risks that were building up on Bear Stearns' balance sheet. He had no idea how Bear Stearns was financing itself day to day. He spent a lot of time playing bridge. He was an incredible bridge player. One of the reasons it's called House of Cards. His number two, Warren Spector, was an incredible bridge player. He was recruited to Bear Stearns by Ace Greenberg, who wanted to be an incredible bridge player, and he wanted Jimmy Kane to teach him how to play bridge better. But of course, he didn't have the aptitude that either Jimmy or Warren had. And then, in the middle of their the hedge funds collapsing and liquidating in the summer of 2007, when he should have been, all of his energy should have been focused on figuring out the dangers that had built up in Bear Stearns' balance sheet. He and Warren, who was a brilliant guy, who was in charge of the whole fixed income department at Bear Stearns, they were off playing bridge in these tournaments in Tennessee where you actually had to isolate for a week. You actually could not talk to anybody outside of other bridge players. Your cell phones wouldn't work. You had to put them, they were locked up. So you would just disappear for a week. And after that, and he liked to smoke pot, which sort of makes him kind of trendy and cool. But it was absurd, frankly, that he was smoking pot, playing bridge. In that 1 week in August of 2007, when his eye should have been completely focused on what was going on at Bear Stearns, he was playing bridge with, among others, Warren Spector, and Warren won the tournament, which pissed Jimmy off, and then he fired him after he got back from Tennessee for coming to the tournament instead of being in New York where he should have been. And I think the real reason he fired him was because Jimmy didn't want to lose to Warren at the bridge table. And next thing you know, there was nobody running Bear Stearns' fixed income group, and nobody knew where all the bodies were buried. Warren Spector walks off with $400 million, and it's just one disaster after another between the summer of 2007 until March 2008, when the company was on the verge of filing for bankruptcy and would have filed for bankruptcy without the intervention of the Fed.
So this whole idea of people, and this brings us now back to Four Friends, because this whole idea of people being in a position where the whole system is sort of set in some ways to rescue you if you make mistakes, number one, although it doesn't ultimately work if you make enough bad decisions. But the whole idea of a whole culture at that level being set up to rescue people is sort of unbelievable to me.
What we saw in 2008, what we're seeing again now, is the nature of the system is that once the Fed starts intervening, by all rights, the Fed was created, one of the reasons the Fed was created in 1913 was to be the lender of last resort. And I walked through this in Why Wall Street Matters. And we've been having financial crises in this country. Obviously, there have been financial crises before Wall Street. There was financial crises before the United States of America. There'll be financial crises after the United States of America is long gone. We have had financial crises in this country on average once every 15 to 20 years. The country was born in the middle of a financial crisis. So in the late 1800s, the person who was solving, in the early 1900s, the person who was solving these financial crises there was no Fed. And the federal government wasn't getting it done. It was J.P. Morgan, the man, the banker. J.P. Morgan, the man, the banker, was basically putting consortiums, was acting like the Fed does today, was putting together consortiums of rich people to bail out whatever needed to be bailed out. Well, somewhere along the line, people figured out that J.P. Morgan, the man, was not going to be living forever, and they needed to have an institution that could be the lender of last resort, and that became the Fed. Okay, now the Fed gussies up its role in keeping unemployment low and keeping inflation low, but really what the Fed does is acts as a lender of last resort when there's a crisis. That's what it did in 2008. That's what it did in 2020. 2020 was 2008 on steroids. And unfortunately, the way the system works, if you're not in that part of the system, is that the only way the Fed can, create a tide that lifts all boats is to sort of levitate the whole market. And that benefits the people who, want to issue, need to issue new debt to, have capital to weather the storm or to refinance debt that's coming due in the short term and wants to push out the maturities. And so that benefits Wall Street, the financial system, people who make money from money. And so you really have to ask yourself, what kind of societies have we become? Both the 2008 financial crisis and this financial crisis occurred under the auspices of Republican administrations who you'd think would be more free enterprise oriented. And yet the Fed has just completely destroyed the notion of free enterprise and has created winners and losers. And we've become this huge, socialist society. I mean, maybe this is sort of like a Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wet dream, if you will. I mean, we've become a totally, the disaster would have been so much worse if the Fed had not stepped in. But I mean, this is not Darwinian capitalism. This is some sort of hybrid that we've created that we don't even know what the effects of it will be yet. So we've created winners and losers once again. And we don't even know what the effects of that are going to be. And that is something that's going to be potentially very distressing.
I wonder what, as you move forward, you said this, for friends, it's very much about the fragility of life. It probably, the flip side of that, it probably also taught you through their life stories something about resilience. So on the one hand, we have fragility of life. On the other hand, resilience, and they're not mutually exclusive. I don't know, what insights have you come up with through your reporting of your four friends, of these lives who you didn't fully know before you started exploring it? What do you know about life now from them?
Well, I think obviously in each case, something of great potential was lost. It might not have been achieved, obviously, because there's many twists and turns that a life can take. Not the least of which is the tragic one that I told about each of these lives taking. Each of them just went out, like a normal day, and it turned out to be their last. These weren't stories of people who were ill or sick. These were people who were just living their lives and were in the wrong place at the wrong time or used tremendously bad judgment that proved to be fatal. But I mean, I don't think it's crazy to think. I mean, I think once John's mother had died and clearly George Magazine was not working out, he was beginning to think about shifting his life's mission. I think he'd started thinking seriously about running for the Senate from New York in 2000. And when he heard that Hillary Clinton was moving to New York to run for the Senate, he demurred to her and then started thinking he was going to run against George Pataki for governor in 2002. It's not crazy to think he would have won that election because he was probably the most charismatic person I've ever met in my life, along with Barack Obama. It's not unreasonable to think that he would have been the governor of New York for 3 terms, and we wouldn't be the 2016 election might have been JFK Jr. versus Donald Trump, and we'd be having JFK Jr. in the White House now instead of Donald Trump. It's not crazy to think about that. As you pointed out early in the conversation, I mean, it was not crazy for John Kennedy Jr. to think about being president of the United States. It just wasn't.
And by the way, incredibly, you give us the full narrative of just really what substandard a student he was. I mean, he really struggled as a student.
But that doesn't mean he wasn't smart.
Right. But all the standard metrics, the LSAT scores, into law school, I'm sure your son got much better LSAT scores to get into Columbia University.
That's because, Michael, the rules did not apply. The normal rules that the rest of us live by did not apply to JFK Jr., just like the rules about discipline did not apply to him at Andover. They just didn't, because he, was the only child ever born to a president-elect. He literally grew up in the White House for the 3 years that he was there. His father was martyred. He lived in the most extraordinary bubble. He was charming, charismatic. He was obviously the most handsome man that, had ever, one of them that had ever lived. And so, he just attracted people. And so it didn't matter that he wasn't a great student. He was still going to get into Andover. He was still going to get into collegiate. He was still going to get into Brown or Harvard, or, he's still going to go where he wanted to go and do what he wanted to do. I mean, and so where he got his credentials didn't matter.
And
right?
The greater tragedy, it sounds like, despite understanding and acting as if the rules didn't apply to him for so many years, and despite his struggles, and by the way, maybe there were, it sounds like, just learning difficulties for him, especially on the math front, but it does sound from your account like he really was growing into himself and really in a position where he could have had a huge impact.
Right. And of course, the irony of his living his life as though the rules didn't apply to him. Of course, he could not defy the laws of gravity.
So one of our first interviews in the series was with former UN Ambassador Samantha Power, and the title of her memoir is
which I'm reading.
The Education of an Idealist. And
right.
It's really fascinating. One of the big, I don't know what part you're up to, but near the end of the book, she talks about this idea of shrinking the change. That even when she was at the center, so close to the seat of power, it was still hard to have an impact. And the only way she was able to really move forward was to break it down, shrink the problem, and then address it that way. And listening to your talk about your frustration, you call it cynicism, but maybe that cynicism isn't idealism, or maybe it is, because it's driven by your idealism. You want to see things better. So I guess the final question I'm going to ask you is a question we're asking all of the 2020 authors right now, which is, what gives you hope? And I hope you have something good to say to me, because after talking to you, I'm moving towards the cynical side, but I don't want to be. What gives you hope?
Well, I guess I am, like Samantha Power, an idealist who's just frustrated. But I'm basically an optimist. I do believe that, I know we'll get through the economic problem, okay, because that's the nature of economic cycles. We will get through this. Whether it will address income inequality, I have my doubts. We will get through the health problem because people are do what they're rewarded to do, and right now there are going to be huge rewards for the company or the people that come up with a vaccine or a solution to that. So that's going to happen. I don't know when, but it will happen. Or there'll be therapies. There's no AIDS vaccine, but there are plenty of therapies to reduce that as the kind of the problem it was. Whether we will be able to, so I'm confident about solving the economic problem and the health problem. Whether we're ever able to solve the problem of injustice, of inequality, I despair over that, because we just haven't been very good at that in the 250 years that we've been around. We haven't, and by the way, not many other societies have been very good at it either. And that's not an excuse.
This is unbelievable. I asked you what gives you hope, and you're talking about despair.
Yeah, well, they're the flip side of the same coin. Can't have one without the other.
By the way, I should tell you, it's so interesting you said that, because, well, I'm not sure when we're going to be posting this, but we are going to be stringing together all these, what gives you hope answers from the different authors. And I was thinking that some of the most fascinating bits of the conversations we've had are with people not talking about hope, but talking about, Samantha Power is really, her whole thing is she had we failed to imagine the worst. When she examined genocides in the 20th century, one of the key conclusions in her Pulitzer Prize-winning work was too many people failed to imagine that things could get even worse. So in some ways, her book gave me hope. Her exploration of genocide gave me hope, because it's like, oh, it tells me that if we would just use our imaginations, not just to imagine good, but to do a better job imagining evil, we might, in the end, be able to respond early enough. But I still want to push you one last time. So what gives you hope?
Well, let me, before I answer that, I just want to say that one of the things I concluded about the 2008 financial crisis in the book about Bear Stearns, and a big chunk of my Goldman book was about how Goldman made it through the 2008 financial crisis, was that it was really a crisis of imagination. People failed to imagine that a bank like Bear Stearns, that had been around for 85 years and had had no losing quarters prior to its last quarter, could go out of business, that Lehman could go out of business, that Merrill Lynch could virtually go out of business without, before being bought, that, you know, if it hadn't been for the Fed rescue, that Goldman and Morgan Stanley might have gone out of business. So it was a failure of imagination. And I built upon that insight, you know, in writing all these New York Times op-eds about what I saw coming in the unintended consequences of the Fed's actions by, you know, pumping up the credit markets and making these huge asset bubbles. And, you know, again, it was designed to educate. It was designed to use the wisdom that I had gained in researching and reporting these books, and in working for 17 years on Wall Street. The whole purpose was to try to, and why I wrote Why Wall Street Matters, was to try to educate people who don't understand Wall Street and the way these markets work, and why it works this time, why it always seems to work the same way over and over again. I tried to bring that wisdom, and it fell on completely deaf ears. So you asked me, what do I have optimism about? You know, as I say, I'm an optimist by nature.
Or what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is a beautiful day like today, nature, being out in nature, beautiful, you know, incredible mountains and beautiful hikes, acts of kindness and generosity give me hope. But they're really, you know, honestly, you know, being in a place like Nantucket gives me hope, because it's so darn beautiful. But no, I don't have a lot of hope for our country at this moment. No. What gives me hope, what gave me hope, was the election of Barack Obama. You know, and him being reelected gave me hope. Gave me a tremendous amount of hope about what this country could potentially. He wasn't perfect, that's for sure. He didn't accomplish much of what I hoped he would accomplish, or what I hoped he would accomplish. But I had I was revitalized by this country after his election and re-election. And unfortunately, the backlash to that is what we have now, which gives me nothing but despair. So maybe the hope is November 3rd. November 3rd gives me hope.
William Cohan, author of Four Friends, and an incredible body of work focused on Wall Street as well. Thank you for joining us on At Home with Authors.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.